and yet now it seems he has been pushed away by the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
It is 10 o'clock. You're watching GB News. Esther and Phil will be here with you momentarily, but in the meantime, Stephen and Eddie with you as we take you through the breaking news this morning. And that is, in the last few minutes, Dominic Raab, the Justice Secretary, the Deputy Prime Minister, has resigned after that report was delivered to the Prime Minister about allegations of bullying made against him. And taking us through all the details, our Deputy Political Editor, Tom Harwood. And you were saying, Tom, in terms of the specific details on this, there were quite a lot of allegations made against Dominic Raab by quite a number of people. Most of them have not been upheld, but two have.
Two have. And it's interesting looking at all of the media reporting around this case, the 5 months that this was being investigated by Adam Tolley. Dominic Raab has something to say about that investigation and the leaks, the multiple leaks we saw from that investigation in his letter. He says, "Finally, I raised with you a number of the improprieties that came to light during the course of this inquiry. They include the systematic leaking of skewed and fabricated claims to the media in breach of the rules of the inquiry and the Civil Service Code of Conduct, and the coercive removal by a senior official of dedicated private secretaries from my Ministry of Justice private office in October last year." Dominic Raab now calling for an independent review into the way that went out, into that systematic leaking, and indeed speaking there against some of those civil servants, saying that they have broken the Civil Service Code of Conduct.
Tom, thank you very much indeed for that. People will have noticed the eagle-eyed that Stephen and Ellie are no longer here, and it's now Esther and Phil bringing you this breaking news today about Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister, resigning. Tom, I just wondered, what will this mean for Rishi Sunak's government? I mean, obviously, he's not just a cabinet minister, he's the Deputy Prime Minister. We're on the verge of the local elections. I mean, how damaging is this going to be for Rishi Sunak's government?
Well, this is clearly a blow to Rishi Sunak, and I think the next few hours really, really matter. How quickly can Rishi Sunak plug the gaps in his government? How quickly can we get a new Justice Secretary? And frankly, will there be a new Deputy Prime Minister? There isn't always a Deputy Prime Minister, of course, under the system. We always have a first Secretary of State, a quote-unquote de facto Deputy Prime Minister, but the words Deputy Prime Minister don't always appear in the list of cabinet ministers. So the big question is, can we get a new Justice Secretary in the next few hours?
But doesn't this show that Rishi Sunak all day yesterday was putting this in place, because they've already said who the people could be, they've all done the briefings for the new Secretary of State coming in, so this time was probably spent putting all that in place. Justice Secretary, of course, Deputy Prime Minister, no, that could wait, don't you think?
Yes, no, I think that is probably what is going on. There's been a huge amount of speculation in terms of who will be the Justice Secretary, and no doubt that decision-making has been going on for the last 24 hours or so.
The names mentioned so far, Victoria Atkins, maybe Victoria Prentice, maybe Lucy Fraser, and maybe Alex Chalk, but they said they might want a woman there.
And this is the interesting point. At the moment, the gender balance around the cabinet table isn't as 50-50 as it could be. Indeed, isn't as 50-50 as it has been in the past. I think it was David Cameron's ministry that had the most gender-balanced cabinet. But Rishi Sunak may well be wanting to look to sort of balance that gender balance a little bit further. But of course, there will be that decision being made. I would be very surprised, actually, if we didn't hear that before midday. I think a time at which these things are sometimes announced are the 11:30 daily briefing that takes place in number 10.
Bring somebody in who wasn't in cabinet, so they don't have to disrupt cabinet. Somebody new coming in, Phil.
Potentially. What strikes me about all this, Tom, is that, in the papers today, Deputy PM Raab refuses to resign. Raab will fight to the death to keep his job on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. And in the statement that you read out, it was quite striking. He's gone down fighting, hasn't he? He hasn't really accepted he's done anything wrong. It seems to me that there must have been lots of wrangling within Number 10, where Dominic Raab has obviously originally refused to resign. The Prime Minister's clearly told him that you either resign or I'm going to sack you. I mean, there's obviously been a lot going on behind the scenes.
Certainly. It's very clear which papers have been briefed by friends of Dominic Raab overnight and which have perhaps been speaking more to people around the Prime Minister. Clearly there's been wrangling between these two individuals. Clearly there's been negotiation and clearly, ultimately, the Prime Minister has put his foot down in this case.
Do you think the civil servants have been throwing their weight around? It was interesting to read that some senior officials at the Ministry of Justice had already leaked to The Guardian saying if he stays in place, they'll be resigning. Were they balancing up those resignations?
Well, I think this is ultimately a big question over the propriety of this whole exercise, because ultimately there was political pressure placed on the Prime Minister by the threat of these resignations. If you don't do this, I will resign. That is a threat that was placed onto the Prime Minister and no doubt has swayed public opinion as well. And it's something that Dominic Raab clearly feels aggrieved about. I return again to this penultimate paragraph in his resignation letter where he says the systematic leaking of skewed and fabricated claims to the media is in breach of the rules of the inquiry and the Civil Service Code of Conduct, as was the coercive removal by a senior official of dedicated private secretaries from my Ministry of Justice private office. Clearly he thinks that there has been this battle between him, his allies, and many within the civil service, that the civil service and some within the civil service have been breaking their rules in terms of briefing against him. I wonder if we're going to hear more about this from his position on the backbenches.
I think the other thing there, as Philip said, he had come out fighting. He's put down clearly that, you know, of course, a minister has got to have oversight of critical negotiations, what's going on, particularly in this case when this is the negotiations over Brexit and Gibraltar. A senior diplomat breached the mandate agreed by Cabinet, so he felt he was doing that. And he also wanted on the record, Adam Tolley, KC, concluded he had not once in 4.5 years sworn or shouted at anyone, let alone thrown anything.
And this is, of course, counter to some of those more extreme briefings that we'd been hearing in the papers, where there were reports of shouting, of swearing, of throwing tomatoes out of a salad, out of a sandwich. There was quite a lot of fruity colour, I suppose.
Veggie colour.
Veggie colour around this story. And I think that Dominic Raab will be conscious that all of the headlines will be Dominic Raab resigns for bullying, Dominic Raab is a bully, and that will lead to many people thinking that all of these stories that we've heard in the last 5 months, well, they all must be true. And clearly in his two-page letter that he sent to the Prime Minister today, Dominic Raab is wanting to put on record that not all of these stories are true. The majority of complaints against him were actually found to be unfounded, and indeed only 2 of these bullying complaints were upheld by Adam Tolley.
What I wonder here, Tom, is about actually the paragraph here in Dominic Raab's letter where he says, in setting the threshold for bullying so low, this inquiry has set a dangerous precedent that will encourage spurious complaints against Minister and have a chilling effect on those driving change on behalf of your government and ultimately the British people. I just wonder how much this will be seen as a watershed moment in terms of how ministers can actually govern, how ministers treat civil servants, and whether or not, if Dominic Raab is right in what he says, in that the threshold for bullying has been set so low, whether or not this could lead to a spate of other complaints going in about other ministers, because I suspect that if the threshold has been set so low, there will be other examples out there as well.
Well, Phil, I think even if Dominic Raab is wrong here, even if the threshold has not been set artificially low, there will be a feeling that it has. This will have a chilling effect in government. Ministers will be less confident in asking demanding tasks of their civil servants. If a civil servant comes forward with, frankly, shoddy work, will a minister be as confident in saying, no, go away, do that again? Perhaps not.
Well, and reports last week about Alok Sharma, that he was calling up staff who he hadn't previously warned, unannounced. He was calling up staff who were working at home, and they were saying they found this as a form of bullying. So already Alok Sharma is under the spotlight, another cabinet secretary.
And certainly there is now the risk of this domino effect of anyone who has ever worked directly under a minister thinking, hang on, did he raise his voice then? Was she more demanding than she could have been? Was that meeting conducted in the most perfect way possible? And we do know that generally the civil service has been described as having a sort of left-leaning bent. Might this turn into a bit of a political crusade? There is the risk there. I'm not saying that this is inevitably going to happen to every cabinet minister or every former minister, but certainly there will be some who now think, is this a way to get back at my former boss?
Tom Harwood, thank you very much indeed. You'll be with us throughout the day as the news unfolds about this. Dominic Raab, Deputy Prime Minister, has now resigned. We're joined now by political strategist and former advisor to Tony Blair, John McTernan. So you will have heard the news, John McTernan, but can you understand maybe the calculations that a Prime Minister would have had to have done? What would Rishi have been doing all day yesterday and this morning to come to this decision?
He will have been wrestling with Dominic Raab, not physically, but mentally and verbally. Like I think when you see a report that clearly has led to Dominic Raab resigning, then you should act quickly. The PM needs to act decisively. And the problem for Rishi is it looks like he's been willing to negotiate with Dominic Raab over this. If Dominic Raab, the crisis. The law of any crisis, of any political crisis, is do immediately what you're going to have to do eventually. Dominic Raab should have resigned immediately. He's now resigned. But if he'd refused to resign the first time, then Rishi should just have sacked him. And I think that kind of dither and delay is really bad for a leader. And one of the weaknesses that I observe in Rishi, and looking at maybe because he's like a nice guy and he likes to consider all the factors, he doesn't act decisively. The thing about being PM is you get hundreds of decisions to make every day. You can't give them loads and loads of hours of time. You actually have to go, this is the right thing to do. And it's pretty clear from Dominic Raab's letter that there were some decisive findings against him. The findings were decisive. The PM should have sacked him, and the PM should have then had somebody to appoint, because preparing for this moment, there should have been people in Number 10 going, your options for replacing him as Justice Secretary are these.
John, I just wondered about where you think that the line should be drawn in terms of what behaviour is acceptable for government ministers, particularly if they're dealing with civil servants who are not delivering on their agenda or may sometimes, in fact, be trying to block that particular agenda. Of course, Gordon Brown was sort of reported to be somebody who used to throw phones and all the rest of it about when he was in government. Is this just a sign of the changing times rather than anything that Dominic Raab's done that maybe somebody like Gordon Brown maybe did when he was Prime Minister and Chancellor?
Look, I think all of us who've worked in Parliament have heard stories about the unacceptable behaviour of MPs towards their own staff, let alone towards government civil servants when they're within government. And I think standards have changed. I don't think standards have changed.
Oh, looks like John McTernan there. We've lost your sound. You're back with us? You're back with us, John?
Oh, yeah, look, I'm just saying, I think standards have changed in the 21st century. I don't think bullying, I don't think verbally bullying, I don't think shouting, I don't think throwing things acceptable. And I think we all know, all of us who work in Westminster, know of colleagues, of MPs, whose behaviour if they were in a private sector company, would lead to them being sacked immediately. I think politics has been too tolerant for too long, and you hide behind this notion that an MP has authority, a minister has authority. Nobody has the right to bully. Nobody has the right to bully in any workplace.
I think, and we have to look at what the word bullying now means, John, because obviously in this resignation letter, Dominic Raab has said it was concluded that he had not once in 4.5 years sworn, shouted or thrown anything at anybody. So looking at that. But when you talk about speed with which the Prime Minister needed to act, other people would say being precise, doing the right thing, looking at the evidence is more important than going to the speed of the opposition or the media. And Adam Tolley QC established the facts. Established the facts. He wasn't drawing a verdict. So the Prime Minister had to come to that conclusion, and surely he needs time for a thorough report.
Look, I think that to say that you didn't swear or shout or throw, that's not a great defense. There are all kinds of ways of bullying people. The way you treat, the way you don't listen to people, the way you treat the submissions that they give to you in office. You yourself know that different ministers have different reputations. Some are loved at the time they're ministers and loved long after. Some, when they're reshuffled out, there's like a mini celebration in the office. We all work with a whole load of colleagues when we're in government, civil service colleagues, political colleagues, ministerial colleagues. To get the best out of people, you have to treat them well. And look, on the question of should the PM move at the speed of the media, the truth is you do. We live in a 24/7 media world, and you have to work at that speed.
John, I just wondered, we are a couple of weeks away from the local elections. What do you think the political fallout from this will be? Do you think it will make any difference in terms of the opinion polls and how the parties perform in say, the local elections or going forward from that?
I really doubt that this weekend anybody on the doorstep is going to say, do you know what? I've decided not to vote Tory because Dominic Raab was a bully. But nobody's going to say, I've decided not to vote Tory because Rishi Sunak delayed his decision. That this is definitely an inside West.
Looks like we've lost Oh, no, he's coming in and out. But that was John McTernan there, and he was a former advisor to Tony Blair. I think the speed, and we can obviously bring in Henry here, Henry Hill, deputy editor of Con Home. The speed with which he needs to act, he's saying, yes, you need to do it to that 24-hour sort of cycle to the media, the call of the media. And Tony Blair was always quick, wasn't he, to give a decision. Do you think that's right today?
Well, it's basically there's a tension between the demands of media management, which in the days of online, you do need to be quick because otherwise journalists will fill any gap with speculation. But on the other hand, the needs of justice can sometimes be slower. Ultimately, you're holding a person's career and reputation in your hands. You should take the time to come to a considered judgment based on the evidence. And but ultimately, if Rishi Sunak did that, what would happen is people online and on television would just endlessly speculate, and it would be hugely damaging. So there is a real tension there.
Henry, thank you. You're going to be with us throughout the show as well. We're now joined by GBNews political reporter Olivia Otley, who's in Dominic Raab's constituency of Esher and Walton. Olivia, thanks for joining us. What do the people of Dominic Raab's constituency make of all this?
I can't hear Olivia. I don't know about the...
Is she?
Ah, here she is. We've got the sound. OK, we'll come back to Olivia a little bit later on when we make sure we've got her sound on this breaking news about Dominic Raab resigning. Joining us now for more is the Conservative commentator Alex Dean. Alex, so was this inevitable or not?
Well, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
I think Dominic Raab has done the right thing by the Prime Minister in resigning. I think it's actually regrettable that he's gone, but it's clearly better if he's going to go that he resigns rather than has to be fired by the Prime Minister, because Raab was and is a leading figure on the right of the party, as you two know better than me, and was one of the few people, even when it was palpably obvious that Liz Truss was going to win the last contested leadership election. Dominic Raab was one of the few on the right who was willing to go out and bat for Rishi Sunak. And Sunak, I think, owed him a bit of loyalty. And if he'd had to fire him, it would not have been tremendous for the Prime Minister. So Dominic Raab, I think, has done the right thing by Sunak. But I do regret and lament that we've lost a high-performing minister for having, as far as I can see, high standards. But Philip, Esther, it is saying worth saying one thing. I haven't seen the report yet. I don't know if you have, but we're all still speculating about the contents of a lengthy investigations conclusive report, which none of us have read.
Alex, you're quite right. We haven't seen it yet. We have actually, and the station has asked for a copy of it as soon as it's published.
Alex,
Yeah.
I just wondered, John McTernan that we spoke to earlier was making the point that the culture in politics and government has sort of lagged behind the changes that have happened in the private sector. Is this something that one day people look back on and say, actually, this has been a catalyst for a culture change that needs to happen in government and in politics and that should have happened a long time ago in the way that people are treated?
And for people who are watching the TV, you can read now that resignation letter.
Yeah, Philip, on the one hand, I thought that what John McTernan was saying was right, that people should be treated with respect. And of course, that's in the core of the ministerial code that applies to all ministers. And it's also true, I think, that the culture in the private sector, in which I work, has come to that conclusion rather more quickly than perhaps in politics. But, if you consider the high-performing, high-pressure environments of, say, a surgeon or a leading lawyer or a leading accountancy firm or a leading management consultancy, where people expect high standards, you will see people have their work graded, people being told if their work isn't good enough, the kind of thing that it seems, at least in part, the former Deputy Prime Minister now was being criticised for. So unless and until we've seen his letter of resignation, we've seen that he hasn't done, he says, a lot of the things that were being said in the more lurid press coverage in the months prior to his resignation. What we don't know yet is what he's actually been found by Tolley to have done. But it does seem that one thing he says he's done is to have high standards and be held to account for having those standards. And the chilling effect, I think, on being able to instruct civil servants as a result of this may be quite profound. And, I worry, as a Tory, they've brought down the Deputy Prime Minister. Who will they be after next? Some of this is party political, some of it is partisan. They've got a scalp. They won't stop here. They'll move on to the next one.
Alex, talking about that, David Davis, who is a supporter of Dominic Raab, said that, Raab's hard-working approach was always likely to clash with the increasingly millennial mindset of the civil servants. Do you think he had a point there?
Well, frankly, I think that's right. And when David Davis was a leading backbencher, having resigned over civil liberties issues when the Conservative Party was in opposition, I worked with him in campaigning on some civil liberties issues and got to know Dominic Raab in his capacity before he was elected. So, I've known the man for a long time. I think he's always had high and exacting standards, and he works extremely hard. He doesn't ask others to do that which he's unwilling to do himself. But I've never seen one iota of hostility or negativity from him. Some of those who've made the complaints would make the point that he supposedly shows that behaviour to civil servants when the door is closed rather than when others outside are present. But all I can say is, having known him a long time, none of that rings true. He's someone who works extremely hard, who expects others to perform to high standards, but is in no way a bully. And now, if you can bring down somebody who is, as I say, has those qualities, who's immune from it, really, Esther?
Well, you might say that Priti Patel was lucky to survive.
Well, if this is the way that, in the end, you can bring down a Deputy Prime Minister, not only was Priti Patel lucky to survive, any minister is lucky to survive.
Alex Dean, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. We're now going to be joined by Catherine Forster, who is outside Downing Street in the rain. Catherine, what's the latest from Downing Street?
Well, obviously, good news for Rishi Sunak in that Dominic Raab has chosen to resign rather than forcing a situation, as we were hearing last night, that he was going to keep fighting to keep his job, and potentially the Prime Minister might have had to sack him, which would have been very difficult indeed. But clearly, this resignation letter, Dominic Raab obviously feels extremely angry that he has been forced into this situation. As he said, he points out that he had called for the inquiry in the first place, and he said that all but 2 of the claims levelled against him had been dismissed, and then its 2 adverse findings are flawed and set a dangerous precedent for the conduct of good government. Now, although he did go on to say, "I'm genuinely sorry for any unintended stress or offence that any officials felt," it's clear that he really doesn't feel that he should have to go and is very, very unhappy about this. But certainly for Rishi Sunak, it gets him out of a very difficult situation because, of course, Dominic Raab was a very, very close ally of the Prime Minister's. He was the first person to come out both times to support him in the 2 leadership campaigns and stuck by him even when it was abundantly clear that Liz Truss was going to win and become Prime Minister. So Rishi Sunak feels a huge debt of loyalty to Dominic Raab, and also Dominic Raab has a lot of support in the right of the party. So there will be lots of unhappiness, but certainly many civil servants, especially in the Ministry of Justice, will be breathing a huge sigh of relief this morning.
Indeed, we'll be joining you throughout the day as this news unfolds and we find out more of what's happening. But we're joined today by the CEO of Downtown and Business, Frank McKenna, and Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. And obviously, we've still got Tom Harwood in the studio with us as well.
Tom, I just wondered from what Catherine just said there, it was quite interesting that she's right, that clearly when you read Dominic Raab's letter, when he says that its 2 adverse findings are flawed and sets a dangerous precedent for the conduct of good government, that ministers must be able to give critical, direct feedback on briefings and submissions, and that in setting the threshold for bullying so low, this inquiry has set a dangerous precedent. Catherine's right, he's clearly very angry about this. He says at the end of his letter, "I remain as supportive of you and this government as when I first introduced you to your campaign leadership launch last July." But do you think if Dominic Raab is so angry and feels that he has had to resign, clearly against his wishes, will he be as supportive of Rishi Sunak as he's claiming to be in this letter?
Well, this is a really interesting question. I think he will feel a little bit betrayed by Rishi Sunak here, that Rishi Sunak has not repaid the loyalty, really, that he showed to the Prime Minister over the last, 6, 7, 8 months since the start of that leadership campaign. And what's interesting here is actually something that some people have noticed online about the letter itself. It doesn't look like Dominic Raab has actually signed it, that the colour grading behind his signature is ever so slightly different. It looks like the signature has been pasted on afterwards. Perhaps so angry was the former Deputy Prime Minister that he couldn't bring himself to sign that letter, and some assistants have had to...
that letter up. It's up for those watching on TV. It's coming up. Let's get to that signature, see if that is the case. Is that...
It does actually look as if it was a... But I mean, we read things into...
We do. I mean, this
obviously,
is...
was it just not easier to print it and get it on?
It might have been for speed. He might have just not signed the letter and just did it digitally for ease, for simple, for it being more simple. But ultimately, it does.
There it is. Hold it on that signature.
There it is. See,
look at that signature.
The slightly different colour grading behind the signature
that
has been pasted on there.
By the looks of things.
But the thing is, this feeds into this narrative, right? that this is not a particularly calm guy at this stage.
Now, Frank, you were nodding your head then about whether you can now depend on Dominic Raab's loyalty if you were Prime Minister. You were nodding your head. What were you thinking?
Yeah, well, I think Catherine was making the point that she thought that this was doing Rishi Sunak a favour, the resignation. takes a difficult decision out of his hands, and perhaps in the short term that's the case. But I think longer term, it gives him great challenges and difficulties. You know, Dominic Raab, big supporter, big beast, if I'm still allowed to use that phrase, forgive the pun, and a very loyal supporter of the Prime Minister. So him going to the backbenches, he's already lost 2 cabinet ministers in his relatively short tenure as Prime Minister. And it seems to me it just adds to that feeling out there in the country. People who are not necessarily focused on politics 24/7, but it gives that sign of a bit of chaos around the government again, I think, another cabinet resignation.
You're close to quite a lot of Labour shadow ministers. Will they be cock-a-hoop at this news?
Of course.
Into that? Or might some of them, if they are envisaging that they're going to win the next election, might they themselves be slightly worried about what's in Dominic Raab's letter, that if they become ministers, when he says in setting the threshold for bullying so low, this inquiry has set a dangerous precedent, might there be some of those Labour shadow ministers who think, actually, do you know what? This may not be good news because we may encounter this when we get into government.
Yeah, there's a couple of points that, I mean, in the immediate aftermath of this, Labour are going to be cock-a-hoop because Raab is a big scalp to take, and they will see this, as I say, as another example of the government in a bit of internal chaos and turmoil. So short-term, certainly. I think in terms of the situation of culture within government, and again, one of your previous commentators was saying this, you know, in the private sector, we've all had to learn very quickly to change the way in which we manage and approach people, performance appraisals. We're very careful to have other people in the room when we're having conversations that may be critical of staff. And government ministers are going to have to get with the 21st century on that, I'm afraid, whether it be Labour or Tory. And for me, you are...
Gordon Brown would be very vocal.
It's a different, it's a different
even in the
time.
football world, you're a big football fan.
Yeah, exactly.
Alex Ferguson is
the hairdryer treatment.
Managers that we've ever seen.
Sure.
He was famous for the hairdryer treatment, getting stuck into people at half-time and giving them a pasting and doing all sorts.
Yeah.
But and
you will
not be allowed these days.
But you will know, Phil, all the managers in the Premier League now say we can't get away with that. And it strikes me as...
They're rather churning and
Dominic
going on
Raab,
after a couple of matches if they do anything wrong.
Dominic Raab, with, you know, whatever you will criticise him for, he's a bright guy. So you would have thought he would have got with that programme quickly and understood and appreciated that change of culture that's happening in our society.
Henry, I just wondered, what do you think... you're the voice on Conservative Home of the Conservative Party membership. What do you think they'll make of this? Will they be absolutely furious that Dominic Raab's been sort of forced out in this way, or will they be relieved that a line's been drawn under it?
I think they will be angry. We don't know to what extent. It will depend in part on the content of the report, because that will determine whether or not this looks like it might have been fair. Because we don't know. It might be that these 2 instances do, upon a reading, actually turn out to be behaviour that you or I would consider unacceptable. But if not, I think they will be angry, because there is a sense, I think, that government ministers are having to push water uphill to try and get their agenda through. Dominic Raab is the big sponsor of the British Bill of Rights bill. It's now not even clear what will happen to that bill, because he's always been its cabinet champion. So the idea that a cabinet minister with the backing of the Prime Minister driving forward an important area of policy can be brought down over 2 claims, both of which sound, at least in Dominic Raab's letter, like they might have been just tough management, if you like, will be deeply concerning.
And we've mentioned before, obviously, Priti Patel underwent all these accusations of bullying. She survived. Dominic Raab hasn't. We see Alex Sharma. People are placing allegations against him. And I wonder if it is more political than it is bullying. It's just an agenda a civil servant doesn't agree with. How safe is Suella Braverman?
Well, we do know that some civil servants, probably not the vast majority, but there are some civil servants who leak policies against policies they don't like to the press, and that does undermine ministerial faith in the civil service. But frankly, some of this, even if it is just behavioural, we need to push back on. The idea that if you're working from home, I work from home, the idea that my boss should have to pre-screen to give me a phone call when I'm on company time is ridiculous. And so I think that what this shows, this and all these other stories, is that the Prime Minister, who is ultimately responsible for the ministerial code, needs to be much clearer about setting what acceptable behaviour is.
Tom, I'm going to ask you about a public backlash, following on from Philip's question, not just a member's backlash, but could the public say, hang on a sec, they don't want to come in from, home, they're working from home, they might not agree with those policies, but that's not the issue, you just need to get on with them. Could there now be public sympathy for Dominic Raab. What do you think?
I think it's highly unlikely, just because the number of people who will be sitting down poring over the details of this case will be relatively few. The number of people who will be reading Dominic Raab's letter in full will be relatively full. Most people will catch a glance of this story. They will see Deputy Prime Minister resigns over bullying, and that will be the most of it. That's how people will be thinking when they go to vote. Most people aren't like the people sitting at home watching GB News right now. They're not going to be looking at every different aspect of this story. So I don't think outside of the political bubble we will get that sort of reaction, but we are starting to get it from some of your colleagues. In fact, Paul Bristow, the Member of Parliament for Peterborough, has tweeted, "We are not a serious country," in response to Dominic Raab's letter, clearly of the view that a minister who tries to get the best out of civil servants, who perhaps drives a hard way to work in his department, that has been criticised by an independent KC, that has forced a resignation. Paul Bristow, at least, thinks that this is unfair and the sign of an unserious country.
Frank, I just wondered, there's been a comparison to how things happen now in the private sector. But, of course, in the private sector, it's a lot easier to get rid of people who are hopeless at their job than it is when
I don't think business owners would agree, Philip.
The
legislation.
I think it's certainly easier than getting rid of civil servants, because obviously the government don't employ them, they're employed separately, and they just get shuffled around. Yeah. I just wondered, what is acceptable? Because if you're a government minister, if you're a boss of any description, and your employees are not delivering what you're asking them to deliver, and we seem to have this thing that you have to be like Sergeant Wilson off Dad's Army and say, would you mind awfully doing this? I mean, how many times do you have to say, would you mind awfully doing this, for it not to happen, before you're actually allowed at some point to sort of hit the roof, to be perfectly honest? I mean, surely at some point there is a place for hitting the roof when the nicey treatment hasn't worked time after time after time. I mean, what are you supposed to do in this issue? You can't sack them. What are you supposed to do?
Well, we in the private sector pay literally thousands of pounds to HR advisors to take us through these very complicated and complex legislation that's been introduced largely by the Tory government, by the way. So the private sector has gone through this for a long time. It's cost thousands of pounds, because not only do you have to hire a HR consultant, but they ordinarily tell you settle, because if this goes to court, you're going to lose. So it's certainly not a public-private sector issue, this. This is a case of a huge shift in culture. And I will put this into some perspective, though. Government ministers from all parties and all governments are set standards that perhaps are different to others outside. I remember Peter Mandelson having to resign not once but twice. He would argue both times he ought not have been expected to resign. The second time, certainly, even the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, said it was a mistake. So government ministers, from time immemorial, are held to account far more harshly than most of us. But I think in this case, point that you made earlier, Philip, about how do civil servants and government ministers relate to one another is perhaps a discussion and debate that will result from Raab's resignation. But until we see the detail of that report, it's difficult to comment any further, really, isn't it?
I might be going off on a bit of a tangent here, Tom, but I will. We know we've got all of the Extinction Rebellion protests in London, 4 days of it, and I did see that the PCS union was joining them. Now, that is the union for the civil servants. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, how politicised are our civil servants now? How left-leaning are they? What was Raab having to deal with if they are now feeling that they can demonstrate for these 4 days in London against the London Marathon, causing aggravation there with the likes of Extinction Rebellion?
No, it is a pertinent point, because we have seen many examples of internal chats that have been leaked within the civil service, most recently perhaps in the Home Office, where there was an open discussion and anonymously civil servants could say their piece. The number of civil servants working in the Home Office who would describe government policy and the democratically in place Home Secretary as something that was evil or fascist or something that they did not want to carry out. These are people employed by the government. And there are examples of this that we can point to that you really can see the civil service as a whole is not particularly conservative. Now, that's not to say that every civil servant is a secret Trotskyite and that they're really trying to undermine everything the government does, but it is to say that in general the civil service does lean left.
And you know, the point Philip says, you know, can you ever hit the roof or what have you? You also have to remember how much a minister is outnumbered. So there is only the Secretary of State and, you know, his small team of ministers. Otherwise, he's outnumbered significantly by civil servants. So how do you apply the pressure if they've all decided, as a group, they're not going to work for you?
Well, no doubt we've all watched Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. We've all seen how the civil servants and senior civil servants may well be able to run rings around the government. That's, in fact, why we saw so many SPADs, special advisors brought in, political appointees brought into government to try and chivvy along the civil service, to try and make sure that various secretaries are doing exactly... Eyes and ears. And we've seen... And it has been massively criticised in the last 20 years, the number of political appointees, special advisors that have been placed in number 10 and in various departments. But ultimately, when you have these sort of conversations, you can start to begin to understand why cabinet ministers will want their own people.
We all know that Yes Minister isn't a comedy show, it's a training manual for the civil service. We can now speak with GB News' senior political commentator, Nigel Nelson. Nigel, thanks for joining us. I wonder what you made of this. I mean, there'll be two camps, I suppose. One camp will be Dominic Raab is a bully. The other camp will be civil servants are snowflakes. How do you see this?
Probably as Dominic Raab is a bit of a bully. I mean, what we're talking about is 2 of the 8 complaints have been upheld. He did promise that if any complaint was upheld, he would resign. So he's quite clearly done the right thing. The actual extent of this bullying, we have to see when the report is actually published. Now, Rishi Sunak has promised to actually release that report. Let's hope we see it today so we get some sort of clarity. Although it's quite clear Dominic Raab is extremely angry from his resignation letter about what's just happened to him.
Yes, I mean, do you think he clearly is very angry from the letter and believes that the threshold for bullying has been set very low, which is a dangerous precedent? Do you think that he says that he'll continue to support the Prime Minister from the backbenchers? Do you think that's true, or do you think he's so angry about this that his support can no longer be relied upon?
No, I mean, I imagine he will support the Prime Minister. I mean, that he's a close ally of Rishi Sunak, which was the reason, of course, that Liz Truss, during a very short premiership, actually sacked him. So I think that there is obviously a personal connection between the 2 of them, and as a result of that, he will do what he promises. And in a sense, that it is the fact he made the promise to resign that has put him in this position in the first place. He says quite rightly, I can't now break my word, nor should he, but I see no reason why he should be disloyal from the backbenchers.
Can I ask you therefore, do you think the questions will move on now to Rishi and about his judgment for appointing Dominic Raab in the first place? Do you think the bandwagon will move on from Dominic Raab to Rishi and the appointment in the first place?
Yes, I think you're right, Esther. I think that's exactly what's going to happen, because what Rishi Sunak hasn't said is what he knew about these allegations before appointing Dominic Raab as Secretary of State for Justice and as Deputy Prime Minister. Now, clearly, if he did know something about this, it was actually a bit reckless of him to appoint Dominic Raab as his deputy. But again, we have to see, first of all, we have to see the report. Then Rishi Sunak will have to answer those questions about whether he knew about this beforehand, that the allegations were out there. I mean, in a sense, it seems inconceivable he didn't know something about it, as the rest of us did.
And it seems over 20 people gave evidence to this report. One of them was Boris Johnson. Now, I believe Boris Johnson had called Dominic Raab aside at once and talked about maybe the way he dealt with his staff. What do you think Boris Johnson's had to say in this report?
Well, I would have thought Boris Johnson in a slightly tricky position, because we know that he kept Priti Patel in place as Home Secretary when she'd been found guilty of bullying. So I'd imagine that Boris Johnson was to actually keep fairly quiet about this. Now, what evidence he actually gave to the report, we can't know until we actually see the report. And that's when this whole thing will become clear, and when we'll be able to actually make some judgments about whether or not Dominic Raab is right, that the bar was set too low when it comes to what constitutes bullying. But broadly, Rishi Sunak has always promised right from the start of total integrity in his government. And to have total integrity, it means that bullying has got to be unacceptable in whatever form it takes.
Nigel Nelson, thank you very much indeed. This story is unfolding. Dominic Raab has now resigned. It's where it's going to go from there. Where is it now going to move to? Is it going to move to the question of Rishi, Henry Hill, or will it move to the unhappiness on the backbenchers? Rishi's got a lot to balance up here, hasn't he?
He does have a lot to balance. I think it would be very unfair, given that only 2 of these complaints are upheld, for Rishi Sunak's judgment to be personally called into question. What, is he supposed to be psychic? You know, so it's not, if this had been a vast campaign of bullying and all of these campaigns were upheld, there would be legitimate questions to answer for Rishi Sunak. I don't think in this case it is. It's very unfortunate for him, but there's no sign that he's made a bad judgment.
I mean, obviously, people are already. I mean,
obviously they will, because this is. I know, but it's politics, isn't it? All of his opponents are going to say, actually, no, he should have been psychic and been perfect and all the rest of it. I think the key question is, one, how does he balance the cabinet? What happens to the legislation that Dominic Raab was taking forward? Because actually the British Bill of Rights still doesn't have all that many champions in the conservative legal space, if you like. You know, Bob Buckland was a big opponent. Will that continue? And then it is one more person who's gone to the backbenches. The Conservative government, you know, it has a big paper majority, but there's a lot of people now on the backbenches who are either former ministers or, you know, realise they're never going to be ministers or are unhappy with elements of government policy. And if you add that up, that's a big caucus of people who can make life difficult. Rishi does need to keep them on board, and therefore he's going to have to find something.
And of course, the other thing, Henry, is I don't suppose it's going to help Dominic Raab's quest to hold on to his marginal seat at the general election.
Actually, that's one thing it may do, because now he's not going to be distracted by ministerial office and he can spend all his time in that seat campaigning hard to heal.
OK, well, Tom, what do you think of that? There's 2 ways to look at it. Yes, he has been released from the demands of Westminster, but obviously there are the reasons that he's been released to be able to look after his constituency.
I think that generally MPs, and please don't take too much offence at this.
I don't like that already. The fact that it needed to come with a warning says it's going to be gone harsh.
Generally, MPs tend to overestimate their own personal vote in their constituencies. If there is a tidal wave coming against a party, even the most hard-working, dedicated, popular local MP cannot stop that tidal wave. An MP and a good canvassing operation, a good get-out-the-vote operation, might be able to move things by 1,000 votes or so, but ultimately, if you're an MP sitting on a majority of what is Dominic Raab's, about 5,000, if there is a 10,000 tidal wave coming against him, no matter how many doors he knocks on, no matter how many fetes he attends or village shops he opens, I don't know, no matter how much work he does like that, he wouldn't be able to stop a tidal wave.
That wasn't harsh, Tom. That was comforting. That was comforting to say, actually, it wasn't you. Frank, what do you think he'll be facing at home? In fact, that first meeting, when he goes back to his constituency, Frank, will be a tough one, won't it? Yeah, I mean, you've been in politics.
Yeah,
you know this.
You know, it's a brutal old game, isn't it? And you know, I suppose what I would say is Dominic Raab is an experienced politician. He's been here before. He was sacked by Liz Truss. So he's not been long back in office. He's lost his red boxes and he's got them back again and he's lost them again. A bit careless, really. So I think that he'll obviously be feeling sore. You can see that from the tenure of his letter. But equally, I think it is a good point. And although I take Tom's point there in terms of people don't have a personal vote, nevertheless, you know, MPs who can spend more time in the constituency, kiss babies, go to garden dates, all that sort of thing. Don't bully anyone, Dominic. You've got a better chance, I think, of holding on to your seat. But he will be feeling, I think, frustrated if the report comes out and is, as he says, not as serious as others are suggesting, then he is going to be sore about it, isn't he? And that, I think, will come back to bite Rishi more than that prejudgment of appointing Dominic Raab prior to the report being published.
Henry, will he come out fighting, or will he go quiet on the backbenches for a little while? What do you think, knowing him and knowing his personality?
Well, I mean, knowing his personality, I think that storming from the gates is perhaps his first instinct. Again, the question will be, one, how is he defending his reputation? When this report finally comes out, I think if he thinks that he's basically being blackened by allegations, he will come out and defend himself. I think he's a pugilist in that sense. The other thing that I think is important is, again, the British Bill of Rights Bill, his legacy, his ministerial work. If that gets junked by whoever succeeds him, that's something that he could end up fighting about in the House of Commons.
And of course, that was put on ice, that was semi-junked by Liz Truss, brought back when Dominic Raab came back. Could it die with him? Very, very likely, I would say. But I think there is an issue here for political strategists, for Tory strategists sitting, how do they game plan what comes next? How do they sort out this? How do they cauterise the wound that has occurred? Ultimately, they will not want Dominic Raab to be taking to the airwaves and saying how mistreated he was. They will not want a big story to come out of when this report is finally made public. And also, they will not want Tory MPs to be talking so much about the dastardly civil service. Ultimately, what they'll want to do is appoint a new Justice Secretary as soon as humanly possible and move on and shut this story down. Whether or not backbenchers will allow them to do that, however, is an open question.
I mean, I wonder what this means for the civil service too, because, you know, quite clearly there is going to be a school of thought that it's basically become a bunch of politically motivated snowflakes who can't take
left-leaning as well with Sue Gray. We've seen what happened with Sue Gray.
Politically motivated, as you know. And I just wonder, I mean, it's probably not beyond the realms of possibility that there'll be lots of civil servants who are not particularly happy with what's happening, because in effect their reputation gets damaged in the process as well. They may think that some of their colleagues should have been a bit more robust as well.
And actually, knowing several civil servants, having family in the civil service, actually, there is no one more critical than parts of the civil service than other parts of the civil service. And so often what you'll find is people who are, and there are so many genuinely hard-working civil servants who do amazing work. I mean, look at the team, for example, who negotiated all of the recent Brexit deals. I mean, the number of sleepless nights those people had, and whether or not we all agree with every jot and tittle with what they agreed on, no one can deny how hard they worked on that sort of stuff. And similarly, we've seen in many different areas. We've recently been celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. The teams that worked on that, incredible dedication. And also in every department, you see those people who've been working, for example, on the UK's accession to the CPTPP, on the trade deals that we've managed to secure around the world. There are so many people who've been working so hard who are let down by those in the civil service who do naff all.
Very technical, thank you for that. But Frank, with you, now looking at that, because I think there is now, people will start looking at the civil service. I've talked about Sue Gray there. There she was, the enforcer, who decided then to move over and become sort of the cheerleader for Keir Starmer. You've got these people now, as I said, the PCS union, the Civil Servants Union, out on the street with Extinction Rebellion, and you've got these others taking cases of bullying. Is the civil service moving to the left, and will people start to scrutinise that now more than ever before?
Yeah, I think it's far too easy to generalise the civil service and put that tag on them. It's a big old beast, isn't it, the civil service? So there'll be people who are conservatives within there, there'll be people who are left-leaning, as you say. But I think what this ought to result in is a serious discussion and debate about how the civil service and government ministers, and indeed opposition, operate alongside one another. Because if we don't trust our civil servants to be neutral, whether that be from the left or the right, Labour or a Conservative government, then that is a danger for ourselves. But just going back to the point about Raab, and I didn't appreciate this until, again, one of your commentators mentioned it, he did say, prior to this investigation being concluded, that if any of the findings were to be found against him, he would resign, and two have. So he stuck by his word. But having said that, then for him to be as angry as he appears to be now would suggest that there's a little bit of contradiction in terms of his behaviour. Because if you say, look, if any of these allegations are found to have been, I'm guilty of, I'm going to resign, well, two have. And whether they're serious or not, he knew going into this investigation that that was the point. He's hung himself on his own petard, in a sense.
And Keir Starmer's been saying that this shows the continual weakness of the Prime Minister. Do you think that's, Tom, the attack line that Labour will turn this into, that this is about Rishi Sunak being weak?
Yeah, the Labour will not want to go down the line of Dominic Raab is the worst bully in the world because, frankly, they haven't seen the report. We haven't seen the report. It may well be that this is a very marginally decided thing, that this was not the easiest decision to make in the world. The easy decision for the Labour Party now is to try to paint Rishi Sunak as a ditherer. Why didn't he sort this out earlier? Why did it take a while for an independent KC to be appointed to conduct this investigation? Why did this investigation take 5 months? And why did it take more than a day to decide this ultimately? That'll be the line that Labour needs to take. But ultimately, if I was the Labour Party leader, I wouldn't really want to be getting stuck in right now. I would let the Tories fight, because there will be a number of Tory MPs who come out and criticise what has happened. There'll be some other Tory MPs who criticise those Tory MPs. And if I was the Labour Party, like so often over the last 2 years, my best thing would be to keep my mouth shut, not say anything, and let the Tories fight.
And, of course, we're still waiting for the Prime Minister's reply to Dominic Raab's resignation letter, which will obviously be fascinating to read.
And GBNews has already asked for that, so as soon as that comes out and the report's published, it will be here. Now, we've been discussing Dominic Raab's resignation this morning from his post as Deputy Prime Minister.
A report from Adam Tolley, KC, was received by Rishi Sunak yesterday. The Prime Minister hadn't decided whether to stand by Dominic Raab or dismiss him from his cabinet. But now that decision's been taken for him by Dominic Raab resigning. Our political reporter Olivia Utley brings us this special report.
One of Rishi Sunak's very first acts as Prime Minister was to bring his old friend and stalwart supporter Dominic Raab back into government after a short stint in the cold. But Raab's tenure as Justice Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister was beset with problems from the get-go.
And I understand too that I have work to do to restore trust after all that has happened.
Just weeks after the Prime Minister stood on the steps of Downing Street and vowed to clean up the Conservative Party, claims emerged in The Guardian that 15 civil servants in Raab's private office had been offered respite or a route out after his return was announced. Within hours of the story breaking, 2 more emerged from Raab's earlier time at the Ministry of Justice. One civil servant told the Mirror that Raab had been given the nickname the Incinerator because of how quickly he burned through employees. Another set tongues wagging after claiming to The Sun that the Justice Secretary once threw tomatoes from his salad at his staff. From there, the allegations snowballed. It was claimed that Raab repeatedly reduced staff to tears and ruined people's lives through coercive behaviour. And so, less than a month after becoming Prime Minister, Sunak found himself fielding questions from journalists on why he'd welcomed his friend back into government with such a tarnished record. Hoping to clear his own name, Raab eventually wrote to the Prime Minister himself, asking for an independent investigation into 2 formal complaints against him, one regarding his time as Foreign Secretary and another while he was Justice Secretary under Boris Johnson.
The Prime Minister requested an independent investigation to be conducted by an individual from outside government.
Adam Tolley, KC, was chosen to conduct the investigation, though it was made clear from day one that his remit was solely to establish the facts of Raab's conduct, not to decide whether he should face sanction. 5 months on, the Tolley report has now been handed over to Downing Street. To his allies, Dominic Raab is a committed politician who demands high standards from his staff. To his detractors, he is a neurotic bully who gets a kick out of picking on junior civil servants. Rishi Sunak may have hoped that choosing a deputy as experienced and as loyal as Dominic Raab would make his own life that little bit easier. If so, he could hardly have been more wrong. Olivia Utley, GB News.
And we're back here in the studio. We've got Henry Hill, we've got Frank McKenna, we've got Tom Harwood talking about that resignation. We've also got lots of your views. Richard says it's time the lefty-leaning civil servants are brought into line and made to do the job they're meant to do and not undermine ministers.
I mean, I've got to say, we've been absolutely inundated with views, and they're pretty one-sided, I have to say. I've been trying to find ones that are saying that Dominic Raab should have resigned, but
I did say this, didn't I? Say the backlash from the public.
Tony says we've had a PM destroyed by cake and now a Deputy Prime Minister destroyed by a tomato. All
Loving that one. The whole panel is laughing.
We like that one. But they're all pretty...
But Wendy says here, I still don't understand what Dominic Raab has done. I would like to hear about Dominic Raab, from Dominic Raab, and his side of the story. She's saying it's pathetic.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, they're very... I was trying to find one with a different point of view, but it's very difficult to find one.
There's a slightly different angle here, and I don't know what... I'll bring you in, Henry Hill, here. It says here, Virginia's looking at the civil service is trying to remove as many Brexiteers as possible. I think a lot of people will be going on. That was what Virginia said. What do you think?
I mean, I think it's important not to ascribe too much kind of conspiratorial coordination to this, right? There's not a big shadowy body in the civil service that's gunning for people, but I think that there is probably a problem is when a cabinet minister like Dominic Raab gives people an opening, there is a culture in elements of the civil service which motivates people to complain, for sure.
I'm just going to give a time check because it's 11 o'clock and we're still here now talking about this breaking news, what's going on, waiting for this report to be published that nobody's seen yet. We just know that Dominic Raab has resigned.
David says here, I believe that this was orchestrated to get rid of Raab. It seems to me that nobody can criticise the civil servants without paying the ultimate price. And there is a view amongst many of our viewers here that it's the civil service who now run the country rather than government ministers. Some might say that was always the case.
Well, of course, it was Margaret Thatcher who said that her favourite programme on television was Yes, Prime Minister, simply because you saw the institutional stickiness, really, with trying to get things done. And to some extent, the bias of the civil service, which undoubtedly does exist, isn't some sort of radical left-wing thing. It's almost a status quo bias, that if any government comes in and wants to change things in a radical way, whether that be radically to the left or radically to the right, or just reform in the way that, for example, Michael Gove wanted to do, which I don't think can be described as particularly left-wing or right-wing, but just sort of more rigorous standards in education, perhaps. I mean, perhaps you would describe that as right-wing, I'm not sure. But whatever happens, the bias in the civil service seems to be, do you really want to do that? Do we really want to change things? Hasn't the way that things have always been, or the way that things have been for the last 40 or 50 years, isn't that okay? And I think that sort of institutional weight, that sort of albatross around the neck of any reformer in government is the real bias there.
Esther, you've been a Secretary of State in the Department of Work and Pensions. What's your view of civil servants and how you deal with them and how they behave when you ask them to do things that they might not instinctively want to do?
Well, I do think there is a power of conversation to be had there, a power of narrative. What are we doing? How do we all work together? What is it we're trying to achieve? So there is that big picture, which you've constantly got to be setting. This is about making sure people are in work. This is about people are filling their potential. This is about making sure that they can spread the horizon. And that constantly had to be said. Equally, one thing I think you've got to have, you have got to be able to come up with the solutions, because these people are incredibly good at detail and putting in place and implementing what you're doing. So I always think if you've got a clear narrative for them, they can do it. It's not for you to tell them or ask them, solve this problem. I want to get out of the, European Court of Human Rights, solve the problem. That's not for them. This is what you're doing. How do you get it together? So I'd always had a very good balance there and working relationship. But going back to Tom's point, whether it's right or left, I think maybe now the demands of having to move quickly, they don't like doing. So this change rather than right or left. And at the moment, You can't say, I'm going to go at the pace I've always gone, I'd like to go, and this is how we've always done it. Things have never moved so fast. You've got things and issues coming from you at all directions. So I think, and I'll come back to Henry Hill here, people talk about Dominic Raab's exacting standards. He was working 24/7, so he expected other people to work 24/7 with the passion that he had. And maybe they didn't, because they were wanting to do 3 days working from home and a 5-day week and a 9 to 5.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that is important to remember is that if Dominic Raab was in the private sector and he was in that position, he would be setting the culture of that business. He would have been directly involved in the hiring decisions. If you signed up for, Raab, whatever, you'd know what you were getting. In the civil service, that's not the case. A minister is inserted into a pre-existing culture which has been there long before they arrived and will be there long after they left. And therefore, it is much harder for an MP, a minister with a particular way of working or a particular set of standards to impose themselves and their working manner on a department. That's very true.
We're joined us now from Downing Street is our political reporter, Catherine Forster. Catherine, what's the latest there?
Well, I think some relief, certainly, that the Prime Minister in the end didn't have to sack Dominic Raab. And, of course, the questions now, what's next? We're still waiting for the report that Rishi Sunak was given yesterday morning. Both he and Dominic Raab had read it in full by last night. But we're still waiting for it to be published. So it'll be very interesting, won't it, when that lands and we're actually able to read the details. Because, of course, as Dominic Raab has pointed out, this is an inquiry that he asked for, and also only two of the allegations were actually upheld. So clearly a lot of shades of grey in this report. And also, of course, the next question, now that Dominic Raab is no longer Deputy Prime Minister, no longer Justice Secretary, who will take those roles? Now, it's perfectly possible that a Deputy Prime Minister will not be appointed. That would be the easy thing to do in the meantime. But in terms of Justice Secretary, a few names being bandied around, quite likely that position will be taken by a woman. The Prime Minister is very aware that the gender balance in the current cabinet is not all it could be. So perhaps Victoria Atkins, who's Financial Secretary to the Treasury, perhaps Victoria Prentice, currently Attorney General, perhaps Lucy Fraser, who's currently Culture Secretary, all were lawyers before they came into politics. So I would imagine that decision would be made fairly quickly. These sort of first day packs have been being prepared in case this outcome is what happened. So let's see what happens next. But certainly there will be questions now over Rishi Sunak's judgment in having appointed Dominic Raab in the first place. He was known as a tough boss with high standards, but of course, as we've discussed, bullying can be quite subjective, can't it? What is bullying to one person is just high standards to somebody else. And Dominic Raab clearly really does feel that he hasn't done anything wrong, although he has apologised for upset or offence that he's caused.
Catherine, I just wondered, we still haven't had the Prime Minister's reply to Dominic Raab's letter of resignation. I just wondered if there was any speculation in Downing Street as to when we might see that.
Yes, interesting, isn't it? Often you get these replies fairly swiftly. I would imagine it will be coming out shortly. And of course, also, we don't yet know the ins and outs of Dominic Raab's decision to resign, whether he was very heavily lent on, whether he was basically given the resign or you're going to be sacked ultimatum. All these details, no doubt, will emerge over the coming hours, but certainly we'll be keeping an eye out for Rishi Sunak's formal response when it appears.
Catherine Forster, thank you very much for keeping us up to date with what's going on there. We're now joined by The Guardian's political correspondent, Aubrey Allegretti. Aubrey, what do you make of this resignation? Has it come as any surprise to you at all, or was it inevitable?
Certainly wasn't inevitable. I mean, it's completely shocking in terms of the style of what's happened and the departure. I mean, if you read the letter, you can see for yourself how much the sort of venom and the anger is flowing through Dominic Raab's veins. He's clearly not somebody who feels like he's done anything wrong. And indeed, he's written a quite extraordinary piece for The Telegraph, which has gone up in the last few minutes, in which he says that it's a Kafkaesque saga, and he endured for sure of the safeguards most people would enjoy. So he's clearly sort of very upset about what's happened, and that creates a potential, the very fragile sort of unity beast that Rishi Sunak has created in the Conservative Party dissipates very quickly.
Aubrey, can you tell us about this story that senior officials at the Ministry of Justice briefed The Guardian that they would resign if Raab was cleared? What does that say, and what were they telling The Guardian?
Yes, absolutely. So when we broke on Wednesday night that the Dominic Raab report, which obviously we've been waiting for nearly 5 months, was about to be handed to Downing Street on the Thursday, I think there was a concern amongst senior civil servants in the Ministry of Justice, who of course have been serving alongside the Justice Secretary since the inquiry began. And they were worried that they thought Dominic Raab would essentially be kind of let off the hook, or rather that Tolley would not uphold their complaints. They were said to be very uncomfortable about continuing to work for him and preparing en masse to consider their positions right up to Director General level. That obviously would have posed a severe problem to the function of government, really, because the Ministry of Justice is an important department. We know that there are issues with reports, backlogs, etc. So if it's not functioning as well as it should be, even though the minister at the top is still there and the civil servants are already very unhappy and thinking about quitting, throwing things into even more disruption because they don't feel like they can do their jobs properly, and that would have posed a real difficulty for Rishi Sunak, even if he's by his deputy prime minister.
How many were there? 1, 2, 40?
Well, it's hard to say for sure. I mean, we know that there were about 24 complainants from across the 3 government departments where Dominic Raab worked, the Brexit Department, the Ministry of Justice, where he currently was, and the Foreign Office as well. But it's understood that there was a group of these people. Obviously, they're reluctant to all come forward and say exactly how many, but some of these people were very senior. We know that the Permanent Secretary, Antonio Romero, had to speak to Dominic Raab upon his re-engagement to the Ministry of Justice. So it seems that the concerns ran very deep.
Aubrey Allegretti from The Guardian, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to join us this morning. We appreciate it.
We're now joined by former Labour advisor Scarlett Maguire. Hello, Scarlett. So, again, has this come as a surprise for you?
I know people who've worked with Dominic Raab, both in the Foreign Office and in the MOJ, and both of them said it was a nightmare, right? That one of them said, no, I haven't actually seen it, but I've had to clear up the tears afterwards in his private office. And in the Foreign Office, they said they were so pleased to have James Cleverly in, that because he just was nice. I mean, I think you have to understand the atmosphere that came with Dominic Raab.
Can you explain then some of the things that he did that had them in tears? What was it? Did they just not like what he wanted to do, or was it his actions? Give us examples.
This is about being shouted at, right? This is about being told off the whole time, right? This isn't actually, whether you're in the private sector or the public sector, this isn't the way to get the best out of your employees. And his private office, which is where a lot of the complaints came from the Ministry of Justice, was very, very unhappy. And this isn't about politics or flakiness or, not doing what you're told. Everybody knows, all civil servants know that basically they do what the government tells them. And it doesn't matter whether the last government was Labour or the present one is Conservative, they do it. The problem with Dominic Raab was the way
you didn't give us an example.
His affairs.
You didn't give us an example there. You said they were being told off. So then you have to ask, was the quality of work being delivered not good enough? And I think we need to have that conversation of what is bullying. Is it asking, the work isn't good enough, could you do it again? Or did it go beyond that? So let's have a conversation. What is bullying then?
I think bullying is when you make somebody so uncomfortable that they are in tears. I mean, I think that if you're unhappy with their work, with their standard of work, that somehow you deal with them so that they do not feel really bad. I mean, the problem with Dominic Raab was that he didn't understand how to persuade people to do things his way, and he had a very tough way of doing things. I mean, he set out in the Foreign Office, they've still got it, how you had to fill in any form, right? I mean, you knew that you had to do it Dominic Raab's way. And people accepted that. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the way he treated people. And, you know, you have to treat people with respect. And it doesn't matter whether they're civil servants or whether they're in the private sector. Is actually a good boss is the person who says jump and people go how high, not, you know, but this is crazy. And that's what happened. And it's, I mean,
Scarlett,
it's
can I...
very... Go on.
Can I should just say that in Dominic Raab's letter, I should say that he does say that Mr. Tolley concluded that I had not once in 4.5 years sworn or shouted at anyone, let alone thrown anything or otherwise physically intimidated anyone, nor intentionally sought to belittle anyone. We haven't seen the report, but I should just put out there that's what's in Dominic Raab's resignation letter. Lots of views from our viewers here saying, you know, we now have the civil service sacking any Brexit-supporting cabinet ministers using spurious and very late complaints. We have the woke left in charge of government, not elected politicians. I mean, are you concerned that lots of people in the country will think that we've sort of got a snowflake civil service who, if they don't like a government minister or what they're doing, that they can just accuse them of bullying and get rid of them?
Look, this is the second government minister that politicians, that civil servants have seriously complained about. The other one was Priti Patel, who was found guilty of everything, but Boris Johnson decided to keep her on, right? And his ethics advisor resigned because of it. It is very rare for civil servants to complain. Let's get this absolutely straight.
But Scarlett, they didn't complain about Gordon Brown throwing his phone around when he was Prime Minister. So why would they not complain about a Labour Chancellor and Prime Minister doing that, but complain about Dominic Raab throwing a tomato in the bin?
The people who were around Gordon Brown and suffered from Gordon Brown were not civil servants; they were his advisors, right? That's why they didn't complain. It's not that the civil service is left wing; it's that actually the civil service expects to be treated properly. And what it isn't about wokeness. It's actually about how to get the best out of your people. Now, Esther is with you. Presumably, Esther never had complaints. And certainly, Esther was very, very political, right? But actually, I never heard a complaint about the way Esther treated people. And that's what we're talking. We're talking not about politics. We're talking about the way that certain ministers treated civil servants. And it is very, very rare. And as I say, this is the second time it's happened in the 13 years of Tory rule, right? It's only the second time it's happened. And in both cases, there was a case to answer. And in both cases, one had heard an awful lot about it before. And one can question why Rishi Sunak did not deal with this earlier, because I'd heard a lot about Dominic Raab before he was reappointed.
Scarlett Maguire, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to bring that point back here to Henry.
Yeah, I want to bring this back to Henry
here.
because I mean, Scarlett's point there, which doesn't sound to be an unreasonable one, Henry, is that, you know, civil servants haven't complained about every cabinet minister, all of whom may well be pursuing policies that they personally disagree with, and that therefore this isn't about snowflake civil servants. It is about people who are not behaving properly. That's the thrust of her argument.
Well, I think it's as I said earlier, it's important that viewers don't get the impression that the civil service is a big conspiracy against the government, right? I think that would be corrosive to public life. But it's not necessarily entirely black and white, because it is possible for the problem of politicised civil servants to be worse in some departments than other departments. But I think the really important question is, as I said earlier, what is an acceptable standard of behaviour? Because when we were listening to some of this, it sounds as if the definition of bullying is basically how the alleged bullied person feels about it. But that's not an objective standard to which you can hold ministers accountable. We do need to be able to say, and I think the Alok Sharma thing about phone calls is the clear example of this, we do actually need to be able to say that a certain level of behaviour is acceptable, whether you personally don't deal with it very well or not. If you can't handle a minister giving you direct feedback or calling you without warning, that's actually not an acceptable thing to complain about. You need to toughen up.
Do you think we need to change the ministerial code somewhat to make some of these things more explicit about what is allowed and what isn't allowed?
So the ministerial code only dates back to about 2010, so I think it's dangerous to freight it with too much significance, but I do think that it is up to the Prime Minister, and this could be part of the ministerial code or it could be a separate document, it is up to the Prime Minister to set clear standards about what is or is not acceptable, and basically use stuff like this as precedent, right? It would be useful if the Prime Minister or the Cabinet Secretary, after instances like this, created things that future ministers could refer to about what is acceptable or not.
It's almost 11:20 and we're talking about Dominic Raab, Deputy Prime Minister, who resigned this morning. I'm going to bring Frank McKenna in here, who is chairman of a business group, a national business group, and talking about bullying, what's acceptable. And we've seen what's been going on maybe in the CBI as well, bullying, what's acceptable. So let's do a bit of comparison there between the political world and the business world.
Yeah, as Philip was saying earlier, he thought it was easier for people in the private sector, bosses such as myself, to get rid of staff if they're not performing. I think that was the case probably 10 years ago. It's certainly not now, because the amount of red tape, bureaucracy and legislation that's been introduced, the hoops you have to jump through to sack anybody these days, it's incredibly difficult.
In the private sector, you might have to pay them off, but you can get rid of them. You can't even do that if you're a government minister and you've got a group of civil servants who aren't performing. You can't see those civil servants lose their job. They'll just get redeployed somewhere else because so what you've got, you don't have the scope to get rid of them in the way that you do.
But the point I would make, Philip, is that we've all had to be mindful of that and change the way in which we manage people. And that means good advice, it means good training, it means people like me having to take a step back and saying, actually, I have to manage my team differently to what I did a decade ago. And I do wonder whether, again, the outcome of this particular resignation should be more support for ministers and politicians. And again, you have an outcry in the country about MPs' expenses. And I always say, actually, it's not the MP who benefits from this, it's investment into a better running government. But if I can just pick up the point about the CBI, Aviva, huge company, have terminated their membership of CBI today. The government and the opposition said that they wouldn't have anything to do with CBI events whilst the investigation into the behaviour of some of their senior management is taking place.
Is this Tony Danker in particular?
Yeah, so I think, well, it goes back further than Tony, actually. And Tony Danker was as upset as Dominic Raab appears to be when he was sacked by the CBI. So
because
I do think we're seeing...
he came out fighting and said, actually, this is out of context. They were trying to say, what was it, sort of come-on sexual sort of come-ons, what have you saying? It's not, I'm the fall guy, this isn't right. Intimidation here in one way or another.
Well, can I get back, Frank, to what Henry's point about what is acceptable and unacceptable behaviour? Henry made the point earlier, which was about a complaint had been made about Alok Sharma when he was a minister, because he'd rung up somebody who was working from home without warning, and that was seen as some kind of grotesque behaviour. I mean, this is a different... I mean, how on earth can that be ever described as being unacceptable behaviour? I mean, what is... I don't think I know anymore what's acceptable and unacceptable, if that's deemed unacceptable.
And it is a minefield. And as I say, I think we've got ourselves into this position because it's not black and white anymore, it's grey. And as Henry was saying, it's not an objective case, it's very subjective. So Dominic Raab may well feel that his behaviour was reasonable. If the people on the other side of the table don't, whose side do you take? And that's where perhaps Rishi Sunak, and maybe where Dominic Raab is feeling let down somewhat, maybe Rishi Sunak should have taken the same view that Boris Johnson took over Priti Patel. And it's the political fallout in the medium to long term that I think will concern the Prime Minister and the government.
Well, maybe the government should and Rishi Sunak should be concerned about what all our viewers are saying. So Paul's saying pretty clear, civil servants are all too quick to avoid doing their job. It's questioning this working from home.
I don't agree with that.
And they'd say, how very disappointing. Dominic Raab has been forced to resign because of the civil servant remainers. And I know you didn't want to touch necessarily too much on that, Henry Hill, but I don't think it can be avoided, Frank, that some of these people don't agree with him politically, whether it's about Brexit, whether it's about the Human Rights Bill, whether it's about Windsor Framework, whatever it is, they don't agree with him. So all of a sudden, you're holding a meeting and they're already holding a lot of views that they don't like about you. So they could jump to being bullied a lot quicker than anybody else would.
Yeah, potentially. But again, you have to take that point, don't you? 13 years of Conservative government, 2 complaints made, one that was upheld very firmly and ignored by a Prime Minister. This one, he's fallen on his sword himself. As I say, he's already lined himself up for failure almost. If there's so many complaints against you say if even one is upheld, I'll resign, and 2 are, then ultimately you have to resign.
I mean, Henry, I've been struck by our viewers who have been very, very annoyed that they feel that the civil servants are running the country and that they're the ones that are behaving wrongly in this regard. Is this going to exacerbate the calls from some people that we should go to an American-style system where you don't have this supposedly impartial civil servants that's there all the time, that you bring in your own people to deliver your own programme? Do you think there might be more and more calls for that in the light of this resignation today?
Well, they do that at the top. I mean, in any bureaucracy, including in America, the vast majority of the staff are going to be permanent. But you do need more political oversight. And we've talked about Yes Minister several times. That was based on the Crossman diaries from the 60s, and he was describing the real difficulty Labour had even then. The bigger government is, the more the state does, the harder it is to oversee.
Well, look now, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has commented on Dominic Raab's resignation, and here it is.
Well, the big question for the Prime Minister is why he was so weak to appoint him in the first place. The second question for the Prime Minister is why he didn't sack him. And now it's left to Dominic Raab to resign, and the Prime Minister hasn't acted. And it's that indecision, it's that weakness, I think, that goes to the heart, not just of this Prime Minister, but of 13 years now of failure. I don't know why Dominic Raab, in the middle of a cost of living crisis, thinks that anybody wants to hear about his whining about having to resign. What I think everybody wants is strong leadership, and that has been palpably absent here. Why on earth was Raab appointed in the first place? Why on earth didn't the Prime Minister act more quickly?
Frank, what did you
make
think
of what Keir Starmer said there, Frank?
I think it's sort of inevitable that Keir's going to come out and sort of punch the Prime Minister when he's got an opportunity to do so. But, earlier I was struck by the comment that the least Labour says at the moment, the better, because there's going to be such a fallout within the Conservative Party itself. Just stand back and watch that fallout. That would be my advice to the Labour leadership at the moment.
It's been interesting, though, isn't it, that not just with this, but with more recently with those adverts that were quite controversial. The Labour Party seemed determined to really go for Rishi Sunak as an individual, not the Conservative Party, but Rishi Sunak. Do you think that's a sensible strategy for them to...
Yeah, I do, because I think that the Conservative brand...
I'm loving your honesty there.
Yeah, because I think the Conservative brand has been damaged. It's a bit toxic, and I think this adds to that sort of, as I said earlier, sense of chaos, mismanagement. Rishi Sunak, on the other hand, his poll ratings are positive. He's more popular in the country as a Prime Minister than Keir Starmer. So those personal attacks, I think, are going to heighten. And this is, again, another opportunity where we can call into question as a Labour Party the judgment of the Prime Minister.
What did you make of what Keir Starmer said, Henry?
I mean, Labour's strategy is very clear. They're worried that Sunak is going to allow the Conservative Party to refresh again, and so they're trying to pin everything onto him. But ultimately, if Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister, he'll regret the fact that he's setting this standard of make snap decisions, don't take the time to consider the evidence. He had a career in justice. He was a prosecutor. He, of all people, should know that if you've got serious allegations against somebody, they need to be properly assessed and measured. And I think it's a shame that instead of drawing on that moral high ground, which before those attack ads he was very keen to do, he's doing the standard politician thing, snap decisions, opportunistic hits.
So, Rishi there realising that the personal attacks are coming his way after those adverts. Do you think this might have swayed his decision to get rid of Raab so that he can be as clean as possible?
I mean, Rishi from the beginning has had to try and basically distinguish himself from Boris Johnson. And so one of the ways that he's done that is by he made a point when he entered office of I'm going to have a squeaky clean government, you know, whiter than white. And therefore, he has set a high standard for himself, and it would have been very tricky for him to keep Dominic Raab anyway. But I think that Labour's gunning for him personally will definitely have made him more wary even than before.
I should just say, not only have we had Dominic Raab's resignation letter, he's also written something for Telegraph Online, which would indicate that his anger at the situation hasn't reduced at all. He's saying that normal rules of evidence and procedural fairness were disapplied. For example, there is a 3-month time limit for bringing bullying claims in an employment tribunal, while standard internal human resources practice is to avoid unreasonable delay. In my case, all the complaints were stored up over 3 months, most over 8 months, some over 4 years, and then submitted in a coordinated way. He says I was subject to trial by media for 6 months, fuelled by warped and fabricated accounts leaked by anonymous officials. So he really doesn't feel that he has been treated fairly at all in this inquiry. So I think this is. I don't think this is going to end today with this. I think Dominic Raab's clearly got quite a lot he wants to say about the whole thing.
Well, joining us now is. We'll be joining Munira Wilson shortly. That's the Liberal Democrat MP for Twickenham. We'll be speaking to her shortly. So, as you say, there could be greater fallout here if these stories come out. If Dominic keeps saying basically he feels Kafkaesque, he wasn't really, they're not really looking at maybe his side of the story. What do you think, Frank?
Well, I'm really interested now to see the report, to see the seriousness of the allegations that he was found guilty about, because it does appear from the statements he's made that there's little contrition because he believes that he ought to have been basically cleared and allowed to continue in his job as Deputy Prime Minister. I think, though, that what the Conservative Party and Rishi Sunak will want is to close this down as quickly as possible and to move on, because the longer this remains a story, the longer Dominic Raab remains in the headlines, the more difficult it is for the Conservative government to move on.
Just to let you know here, it's in Dominic Raab's article in the Telegraph. He says that this is... He said that... Because it said that the report has criticised him for 2 issues. He goes into detail here about what those 2 issues are. He said, after answering questions for 17 hours, the inquiry found against me on 2 issues. This is what he says. First, as Foreign Secretary, I made changes to the personnel conducting the Brexit negotiations on Gibraltar with Spain.
Which he mentions in his...
Having found out a senior negotiator had gone beyond the democratic mandate set by Cabinet, putting UK sovereignty at risk. The change involved no demotion or longer-term detriment. It was essential to securing a deal with Spain at 1 a.m. on New Year's Eve, a week after the main UK-EU free trade deal was done. Nevertheless, Mr Tolley concluded I had abused my position in relation to that official, having expressed my frustration at the lack of candour I received, although he did not conclude it was intentional. The second adverse finding was at the MOJ. The inquiry gave 3 instances where my feedback to senior civil servants was overly critical, which, however justified, left those concerned feeling insulted. Mr Tolley concluded I had on occasion said that work lacked basic information, no specific dates were given, nor who was offended. In one meeting, he found that I said the department was being obstructive on human rights reform.
So
they
basically,
were the 2 issues that he says he was criticised
padding out his resignation letter there, so you can read that in the Telegraph. But look, there's plenty more still to come today on Friday morning with Esther and Philip. We'll keep you updated as it happens, as the news unfolds on the updated fallout from Dominic Raab's resignation. But now it's time for the latest news with Bethany.
Esther and Phil, thank you. Good morning. It's 11:32. I'm Bethany Elsey in the GB newsroom, and we'll start with an update on this developing news this morning. As you've been hearing, the Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Minister, Dominic Raab, has resigned. It follows an independent investigation into 8 formal complaints made about his behaviour, accusing him of bullying. The complaints involve at least 24 civil servants and relate to his previous cabinet positions under Boris Johnson. In his resignation letter, Mr. Raab said he felt duty-bound to accept the outcome of the inquiry, but described some of the findings as flawed. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, was given the report findings yesterday and had been accused of dithering over whether to sack his deputy. Well, in the letter, Mr. Raab goes on to say, in setting the threshold for bullying so low, this inquiry has set a dangerous precedent. It will encourage spurious complaints against ministers and have a chilling effect on those driving change on behalf of your government. While opposition parties have responded, the Liberal Democrats are calling for a by-election to be held in Dominic Raab's constituency, and the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has criticised Rishi Sunak over what he called indecision and weakness in allowing Mr. Raab to resign.
Well, the big question for the Prime Minister is why he was so weak to appoint him in the first place. The second question for the Prime Minister is why he didn't sack him. And now it's left to Dominic Raab to resign, and the Prime Minister hasn't acted. And it's that indecision, it's that weakness, I think, that goes to the heart, not just of this Prime Minister, but of 13 years now of failure.
In other news, retail sales fell by more than predicted last month, with shops, department stores and garden centres all reporting declines. Data from the Office for National Statistics shows sales volumes dropped by 0.9% in March. That's after a 1.1% increase the month before. The ONS blames poor weather conditions and the increased cost of living. And defence ministers from the Ukraine Defence Contact Group are holding their 4th meeting. US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin is hosting the meeting at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, with Defence Secretary Ben Wallace also attending. The NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg says he expects Ukraine to eventually become a member of the alliance, but that the priority is ensuring it wins the battle against Russia. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+, radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News.
Thanks, Bethany. Welcome back to Friday Morning with Esther and Phil on the day of Dominic Raab's resignation as Deputy Prime Minister. We've now had the letter back from the Prime Minister to Dominic Raab, which says, "Thank you for your letter, Dear Dominic, thank you for your letter notifying me of your decision to resign from your position in His Majesty's government as Deputy Prime Minister and Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice. It is with great sadness that I have accepted your resignation. When I became Prime Minister in October last year, I pledged that the government I lead would have integrity, professionalism and accountability at every level. The ministerial code requires ministers to uphold the highest standards."
Can I just interrupt you there and say that was very much what Henry Hill was talking about, that he had to say that, and that was paragraph 2.
He goes on to say, "When formal complaints about your conduct in different ministerial posts were submitted last year, I appointed at your request an independent investigator to conduct a full investigation into the specific facts surrounding these complaints. Adam Tolley KC has now submitted his report, and I have carefully considered its findings, as well as consulting the independent advisor on ministers' interests." As you say...
If you're watching it on TV, we were showing that, the letter from the Prime Minister back to Dominic.
As you say, you had rightly undertaken to resign if the report made any finding of bullying whatsoever. You have kept your word. But it is clear that there have been shortcomings in the historic process that have negatively affected everyone involved. We should learn from this how to better handle such matters in future. He then goes on to compliment Dominic Raab for his record in government as Secretary of State for Justice and Foreign Secretary, and when he stepped in when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister and he was his deputy. He does say at the end, "I look forward to receiving your support from the backbenchers," and so we'll see whether or not that...
I wanted to ask a question here to Henry. When you're writing the follow-up, the answer, as the Prime Minister, will you have just written it yourself, or do you think maybe Adam Tolley the KC will have looked over that? Do you think there will be lawyers reading that, hence the time delay in getting it back?
There will be lawyers, there will be his communications professionals. Ultimately, this is a news item and it is a public statement. It is not simply Rishi sitting down at his desk and rattling something off to his good friend Dominic. This is a public statement. It will have been done with officials, which is why it took so long to appear.
I mean, it's quite striking, Frank, in this letter that Rishi Sunak doesn't criticise Dominic Raab's behaviour, it seems to me, in this. He didn't take that opportunity. He made the point that standards are very important and all the rest of it, which is a general
And that's why I thought
point.
it was a very much a legal letter.
And he did then go on to say that there have been shortcomings in the process. So it seems to me from the reading of this that Rishi Sunak at least has some sympathy for Dominic Raab's predicament.
Yeah, and given the article that he's written for The Telegraph, it sounds to me as though, you know, this was the lower end, if we could put it that way, of bullying allegations. And equally, though, it sounds to me as though Dominic Raab has jumped before he was pushed, maybe reluctantly pushed. But I do think the tenor of the letter, again, is to suggest that we can't even have the slightest taint of scandal around the government because of the commitment I made when I became Prime Minister in terms of the way I was going to operate government.
Right, thanks there, Frank. Joining us now is the political editor for the Daily Express, David Maddox. Now, I know David Maddox spends a lot of time in the House of Commons. I'm just wondering, have either you been speaking to MPs on the backbenches, whether they've been calling you up, confiding in you? How has the news gone down in Parliament?
Well, it's been a bit mixed, to say the least. There is some sympathy for Dominic Raab. There is a feeling, I think, that the threshold has been set very low. But it's, you know, it feels like that this has been a slow kind of train crash coming for months now. And there's a kind of acceptance, really, that, you know, there was a certain inevitability about it. And now I think amongst some quarters there are questions about Rishi Sunak's judgment about the people he chose to surround himself with. You know, if you add the Gavin Williamson stuff along with Dominic Raab.
I mean, do you think there's any mileage in that, David, in terms of criticising the Prime Minister for his judgment in appointing Gavin Williamson and Dominic Raab in the first place? Or do you think that most people will think, well, you know, it's not the Prime Minister's fault that there's a report that's found against one of his cabinet ministers? It's just sort of unfortunate.
I think it'll be hard for him to avoid criticism. Let's put it like this, because, you know, there were red flags on both men. Now, both of them were very capable ministers as well, so very good reasons to appoint them. But there were red flags in the past about them, and of course it's all come out. But I think the Gavin Williamson one was much more straightforward. This business with Dominic Raab, I think, has a lot to run in it still, and there's, you know, issues around how the Civil Servants Act with ministers as well, which are going to be problematic going forward.
Now, we're reading what Dominic Raab put in the Telegraph. It seems to be an expanded version of his resignation letter. I know you know him well. How will he be feeling, and what do you think his next moves will be? Will he have got it off his chest and he'll go quietly to the backbenches? What will he be doing?
I think he will remain quite loyal to Rishi Sunak. I think he will be hoping to make a comeback. I think he's laid the groundwork for that by not really accepting the charges made against him. And you can see a route back in, you know, maybe after the next election. If his government had longer to run, then, you know, maybe in a year's time. But I can't believe he'll come before an election. But you could see a route back for him. If he's sensible, he'll probably go and do some work on, you know, anti-bullying and all this sort of business. But this isn't the end for Dominic Raab. That's my gut feeling on it.
David, I just wondered what's the feeling in newspaper newsrooms about all of this? Because, I mean, I'm not being funny, but they don't have a reputation for being soft, easy workplaces and with kind, understanding bosses who speak like Sergeant Wilson, ask if you'd mind awfully doing something. Is there a bit of nervousness going around these news rooms at newspapers about how people behave with their staff there?
I mean, strangely enough, even in newsrooms, the culture has changed quite dramatically, certainly from the days when I entered the industry. I mean, bullying was the de rigueur of daily life, I'm afraid to say. But the kind of old hacks like me are probably a bit thick-skinned, saying, what's all the fuss about, frankly. But you know, some of my younger colleagues a little bit more sympathetic towards the civil servants.
David Maddox, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And now joining us now is our political reporter, Olivia Utley, who is in Dominic Raab's constituency of Esher there. So tell us, what have his constituents been saying about his resignation?
Well, I heard one of your guests earlier suggesting that this is a bit of a Westminster story, and from what I'm hearing here in Esher, I think that's probably true. Quite a lot of the constituents who like the Conservative Party, who think that Rishi Sunak is doing a good job, on the whole think that Rishi Sunak probably just about made the right decision to get rid of him because he's managed to take accountability, but it won't be affecting their decision on whether or not to vote Conservative at the next election. I've also had quite a lot of Dominic Raab's constituents reacting with absolute glee to the fact that he has resigned, but those are people who never would have voted Conservative anyway. What people are more keen to talk about here are the issues facing their local community. They're very worried about the ULEZ charge, they're worried about rising crime, and they think that this is really a bit of a distraction. So anyone who didn't much like the Tory party think that it's rather good news that Dominic Raab has gone. Those who are supporters of Rishi Sunak feel that he made the right decision. I have spoken to a few people actually who've dealt personally with Dominic Raab in his capacity as their local MP, and they all believe that he did a very good job. One even went as far as to say that she couldn't believe that he was a bully. So there are definitely mixed opinions down here, but at the end of the day, it doesn't sound like it's going to affect people's decisions on what to vote at the next local or general elections.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed for that. We'll let you get out of the rain, Olivia. I think there it's going to be pouring it down in Dominic's constituency. I thought that was interesting, Henry, what Olivia said there. That actually, this is one of those things whereby, if you weren't a Conservative voter, that you are delighted and think Dominic Raab's terrible and the right decision's been made, and if you are a Conservative supporter or a Dominic Raab supporter, you think that he's been badly treated and that actually it hasn't really changed anybody's opinion. Do you think there's a lot of truth in that?
For the most part, yes. I think one of the slightly depressing things for a political journalist or for people who live and breathe politics 24/7 is when you do go out into the country sometimes and you realise just how little of it actually filters through. I mean, it will confirm people's perceptions, and ultimately, if you're well disposed, but also it's not just about whether you like the party. It says something about the kind of workplace culture you want. You know, David Maddox there was talking about an older workplace culture where we were thicker skinned, and this kind of conduct just didn't actually upset us as much. There'll be people in that constituency who feel the same way.
It's interesting, she said, and I didn't know whether we could speak to those constituents, if Olivia's there, if those constituents are there in Dominic Raab's patch. But she talked about the ULEZ scheme, that ultra-low emission zone, and basically a tax on motorists. She's talking about the rise in crime that people are, affected by. This is the issues they want dealt with, and they might think, in all honesty, they might need somebody as tough as Dominic Raab to deal with ULEZ, to deal with rising crime. So actually, they might have a very different point of view, because some of these are so big an issue. You will need somebody who's going to, and this is where we've got to be careful, ram those changes home. Not necessarily sit back and say, is it all right with you? Could you possibly do it? And they've got to be done urgently.
Yeah, listen, I think that increasingly as the story has unfolded this morning, there is more sympathy for Dominic Raab than perhaps at the outset of the investigation even. I think, though, that what will be frustrating for Rishi Sunak in the government is the fact that we are once again talking about a personality and an individual problem rather than those issues that the Prime Minister has said he will begin to address. So cost of living crisis, inflation, interest rate, all of those issues that people care about. And as Henry said, this is really a Westminster bubble story. Out there in the country, people will start to begin to feel as though this government's become a bit John Major-esque, if you don't mind me saying so. You know, one scandal after another. They don't look at the detail of whether he's being treated fairly or not. They just see another government minister having to fall on his sword. And that is the problem that Rishi Sunak's got now. He needs to move this story on quickly and get back to those bread and butter issues that the electorate actually care about.
Well, it's 11:48 and we're talking about the top story of the day, and that is Dominic Raab resigning there from being Deputy Prime Minister. We're talking about how it's unfolding, what he's written in the papers, what his allies are saying, what his opponents are saying. Phil?
I just thought, Henry, I thought Frank made a reasonable point that whatever the rights and wrongs of it, and even whether on the whole people care so much, it does feed into this idea that the government sort of lurches from one disaster to another, and that, you know, Rishi Sunak's sort of big selling point was about being competent and steadying the ship and all the rest of it. And this sort of undermines that narrative, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It creates a sort of sense of fin de regime, and once you've got that, it's very hard to get rid of. You remember John Major actually was personally quite popular and delivered several years of strong economic growth. Yeah. And it didn't actually matter in 1997 because the public had made up their minds about the Conservative Party. And I think there's a danger that the same thing ends up happening here, where Rishi could actually perform quite well. He could actually deliver on his 5 promises, but the public have just decided that this is more typical of what the government is like, and that will be fatal.
I've got here, in his findings on a complaint into Dominic Raab's conduct as Foreign Secretary, Adam Tolley, KC wrote, in reaching and implementing this management choice, he acted in a way which was intimidating in the sense of unreasonably and persistently aggressive conduct in the context of a work meeting. It also involved an abuse or misuse of power in a way that undermines or humiliates. He introduced an unwarranted punitive element.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with that is
I mean, those words seem quite damning there, Philip, don't they, what the KC said?
But they don't actually say what he did. That, you know, I mean, I think the thing is with all of these things is that, you know, somebody sees some behaviour, and to some people they think that's perfectly reasonable. And some people think that that's, you know, belittling, undermining, whatever. I mean, Frank, I mean, it didn't really seem to get us much further on in terms of actually... what people want to know is...
What did he do?
And not really get... And by the way, nobody has really been able to answer that question. I've asked various people, what did he do? Can you give me examples? No, they couldn't. So we've got our viewers saying, Alison says, witch hunt and nonsense. Mike saying, now we know the civil servants is running the government. Terry says, what a fiasco. Absolute waste of time and money. And Nicholas says they decided their justice before the inquiry finished. These are all our viewers coming in with how they see it, how they perceive it there. Well, look, it's been a morning always to remember, never to forget. Frank McKenna, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Seems you've got
lots of
more
views that have been coming in. I mean, do you think, Henry, on that particular point, that, you know, what really we all need to know here is exactly what happened? Yeah. What the actual behaviour was. But it's not because, you know, we appreciate that the person who was tasked with doing an independent report has found that the behaviour was unacceptable, but that doesn't mean to say that everybody else in the country would consider.
Well, all of those are subjective value judgments. He's basically come and said, well, that was unacceptable. You're like, oh, that sounds bad. But you want to know. Also, does Dominic Raab know? Because one thing I picked out, I think, from his note earlier, he says, I wasn't given dates for some of the allegations. If you're not given the date of the meeting, how can you possibly know what you're defending yourself against? You don't know what conduct they're even talking about. So Dominic Raab might not even know what the behaviour was, let alone anyone else.
So I think that's, you know, what we're saying. We've called for this report now to be published. You've asked for it, GBNews. I think this is now going to be key. And I actually think by the views that are coming in, our viewers won't be happy until they get report.
Listen, you need a lot more information about that. And it will be interesting to see what Boris Johnson's evidence was as well, won't it? Because, you know, again, the personality and that sort of how you take that evidence and whether you treat that as 100% there, because there was a fallout between Johnson and Raab, right? So I think there's more to come out of this story. Labour Party will be delighted. If they stick with this, the press run with this for another week or so, that's absolutely meat and drink for Labour. Rishi Sunak, on the other hand, needs to move this story on quickly and get onto that agenda that we spoke about earlier.
And what Henry Hill will know, always before local elections, councillors say, please don't let anything happen before our local elections. If we're doing fine, we don't want the conversation on the doorstep to change. Is this a game changer for the local elections?
Well, again, it doesn't really sound like it based on what Olivia was saying from Esher, but it does mean that lots of councillors who do lose their seats will be able to blame Dominic Raab. So perhaps that'll be a comfort for them.
Well, I mean, I suppose that the Conservatives are particularly worried about the low turnout in the local elections. Is this another reason for Conservative voters to think, oh, do you know what? I can't be bothered turning out to vote. Could it have that impact?
Yeah, absolutely, because, one, it's about how much of the electorate supports you, but two, it's about how enthusiastic are your supporters about turning out if it's raining, if it's cold.
You see, you say that, how interesting these voters here writing in, furious the way Dominic Raab has been treated. They actually, rather than not going out to vote, could now be forced to
motivated to do so.
Motivated. You couldn't believe it, could you? Frank McKenna, thank you for being with us all morning, CEO of Downtown in Business. Henry Hill, as always, fantastic to have you with us as well.
That's all we've got time for today. Up next, it's going to be GB News Live with Tom Harwood. He's going to be bringing you all the latest developments as it unfolds throughout the day on Dominic Raab's resignation. But before all of that, you've got the even more important weather.
Hello again, it's Aidan McGibbon here from the Met Office. Another sunny day for Scotland and Northern Ireland, less so for England and Wales. It's going to be cloudier compared with recent days, and there is some showery rain turning up. We've already seen those outbreaks of rain move in from the east through the night, and they'll spread across much of England and Wales during the rest of Friday. But high pressure remains close to the north of Scotland, and so the best of the sunshine once again will be for Scotland and Northern Ireland. A couple of exceptions. The far south of Scotland will see the cloud thicken with 1 or 2 showers, and the far north of Scotland will see some mist and low cloud, especially around the beaches. But for England and Wales, that's where the thickest cloud will be, with some outbreaks of rain or showers, some heavy downpours across central parts, and that will have a knock-on impact for the temperatures, 11 to 13 Celsius, so a few degrees down, especially across western parts compared with recent days. But 20 Celsius still possible for the Western Isles. And for Scotland, as well as Northern Ireland, we keep clear spells going into the evening. As a result, it will turn chilly. There'll be some mist and low cloud creeping into the northeast of Scotland, and some higher cloud coming into the south of Scotland. Outbreaks of rain for northern England through the nights. Showers